starting only 4 minutes late today. And so I'm going to introduce Anna Bierbrauer. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Planning. Actually, it's the reverse, right?
That's okay. We can be more important than
she's a professor of landscape architecture. So and I met Anna when we were both moving from Denver to Madison. So we both came to UW-Madison from the University of Colorado, Denver, where we were both working in the geography department there. Also where Anna got her PhD in geography planning and design, which was a joint program in geography and the College of
architecture and planning. Yeah.
Architecture and Planning. Anna knows I can never get these colleges and
There's a lot of
departments right.
and they change. Yeah.
So I just learned on her website today that she's interested in how power dynamics, cultural values, and changing climates challenges values, approaches, and management of urban and regional landscapes, which is some of what she'll be talking about today, looking at a case study in Denver. And before we start, some fun facts about Anna. One of them I already told you, which is that we both moved here at the same time. Another is that we have gotten to know each other while taking classes at the Madison Circus Space. Some of you have come to our show last November.
Oh, hey, cool.
Now we're taking trapeze. It's
Yeah.
fun. Last fun fact, she was once the gardener for Bob Dylan.
True.
I learned that after knowing her for like a year. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Anna Bierbrauer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, very nice to be here. I'm going to have some questions for you, so make sure you're not feeling shy. Alicia gave me a very thorough introduction, but just to give you a little bit more of a background, I think it's helpful, especially when talking to students, graduate students, undergraduate students, that my path to right here took a long and windy way, as the note about Bob Dylan is gardener is one of them. But I have an undergraduate degree in performance theory and political systems from George Washington University. And then I worked in professional theater for 10 years. And then I went back and got my master's of landscape architecture at the University of Minnesota. And then I practiced some more in landscape architecture and then eventually went back and got my PhD in Denver. I started that in my late 30s. So I am not an academic that's only been in academic spaces, but I keep coming back to academia for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is, I think, right here is the opportunity to hear from students, to take the time to develop ideas, like you'll see this in this today. And I really enjoy both of those two things. So without further ado, I'm going to be talking today about a method that I used and have kind of been refining over the last couple of years, and really blends, I think, my both work in the applied field of landscape architecture and urban planning, as well as my movement toward wanting to think about how the methods of planning and landscape architecture can be both more multidisciplinary as well as more conscientious of historical contexts, social ecological demographics. So this is a reflection, I think, of that. So first, I would like you to think for a moment, if you will, what an urban forester might think or ask, what research questions and data sources might an urban forester use when looking at this tree? No wrong answers. Yes, please.
Lose its leaves.
Okay, so
not necessarily the same age, but
the phenology, it's seasonal life cycles. Sure, great. Okay. It's age, right? How old it is. It's anything else?
Is it a Dutch elm?
It's close. It is a Siberian elm.
How much cooling it contributes?
Yeah, the quantitative impacts of it in terms of urban heat mitigation or cooling of this individual house right there, energy savings.
When you said Dutch elm, I meant as far as its susceptibility.
Siberian elms are not susceptible. But yeah, good point. In terms of what it might be susceptible to, in terms of its health, is another one. Yeah, absolutely.
native or not native.
Non-native or native. This one. Why is it? So, how about this tree? How would a cultural geographer think about this tree?
When was it planted?
When was it planted? How did it get here? What was happening when it was planted? Absolutely.
Just to have it historic significance.
Yeah. There are trees that have cultural significance in terms of its historic place and where it was. Does this one, would it? Anything else?
The community interact with it or like plan around it?
Yeah, the sort of connection to it in terms of human interaction, whether that's sort of a placemaking or stewardship or just kind of a landmark, right? It might be a visual landmark for somebody who's navigating the city. Yeah, but really that like human side of its interaction. So really what you're hearing here is a good combination of how I look at plants in the city. I have them in my mind as both a physical object that landscape architects and urban foresters in particular in trees are sort of always taking stock of what we have, how it's doing, what needs to be done, what has been done to it, kind of its overall impact in terms of how it impacts the physical environment around it or interacts with other parts of the ecosystem, what it might support in terms of biodiversity and other animals. But I'm also thinking a lot about, well, why this species and why this species here? And in particular, this one's kind of the one we showed was kind of interesting because it is a Siberian elm. It's not a tree that you would necessarily choose to plant. It's kind of called a weed tree or a trash tree, but it's actually really well pruned, so it's kind of interesting that it's taken on that level of stewardship. It's also amazing that it's dwarfing that tiny little house. So kind of thinking about like, what were the trends, the design trends that supported that? Where did that tree come from? Did it just show up? Was it an adventive tree that was planted by something? Or was it purposely planted by a human? And so really, I am thinking about trees as artifacts because one of the things that I really want to do in my world of landscape architecture and planning is to be able to really think about how we as professionals are shaping the built environment with one usually a dominant cultural perspective. And if we aren't kind of aware that that's part of what has been or is going on right now, it's a little bit harder to think about how that future can be really just in a way that is really inclusive of a lot of different people. So I think for me, it's really about thinking. I've been working in landscape architecture history for a long time, but bringing plants into that conversation because it's the medium that really separates us from a lot of other parts of the built environment. Yet it's not really included in the historical context. It's thought about either from this quantitative side or from sometimes a cultural side, but not necessarily across the entire city. This does not want to go forward. Now, okay. So I started thinking about this a little bit in terms of, I was actually, just to give you a little bit more background, I was in a GIS class at the time, and one of my professors mentioned a time series data set and started thinking about, oh yeah, I had, in truth, really hated my master's program GIS classes. But in my PhD program, started to realize that I could use them as part of my historical research, which really got me excited. And so I really started to look at the readily available data sets that are available on open data catalogs and easy to find. And thinking about, okay, well, what is out there and what is my hard evidence? Well, it turns out trees are there and they are very well documented when it comes to data sets. And in terms of thinking about them historically, there is an ecological modeling for thinking about trees' growth into the future. And if you turn that, it can also be about into the past. So Michael Hauer et al. Developed this formula for backcasting and forecasting growth of trees for the city of Milwaukee to be able to kind of look at the impacts of Dutch elm disease and the removal of trees and sort of go back and say quantitatively how much they've lost. And so I was thinking about how I could also use this in my work. So I've kind of thought about the data sets that I had available, what are easy to come by. One is Denver Open Data Catalog is pretty robust. And between 2014 and 2016, they completed a tree survey of the entire city, and that's available on all of the street trees, anything on public property. The IPUMS National Historic GIS data sets available. See some nods. It's pretty, but some really phenomenal opportunities to investigate what you can see from a historic standpoint. As well as I mentioned, one that came up in one of my classes, but has now been a part of a few different pieces I've worked on, is some colleagues at USGS developed a time series land cover data set. It had 43 land cover classifications, so it's at the 1 by 1 meter scale, so it's very fine grain, and it's for 1937, 57, 77, and 97. So being able to see it's all of the Front Range, being able to see the change in land cover, land use and land cover over those periods has been really interesting to look at. I also spent a lot of time in historical archives, Denver Public Library, special collections at CU Denver Library, looking specifically at the municipal archives and thinking about what kind of, when were decisions made about different parts of urban infrastructure, tree planting campaigns, et cetera. Especially a couple of specific landscape architects. There's one landscape architect in Denver, Sacco de Beer. He worked from 1914 until he died in 1974. So he is all over Denver's built environment. And he was worked for a really long time and archived all of his work, and that all sits at Denver Public Library. So had an opportunity to really look at his career over a long trajectory of time. And then I did some other just archival looking at newspapers as well as professional publications. There's a publication that started in the 1940s from the Denver Botanic Garden that was it's really publicly disseminated, but it is professionals from landscape architecture, urban forestry, local nurseries, all talking to the public. So excellent. And then what I love about GIS is that it really allows me to make that spatial. And once I can digitize old maps or use the original data sets that are available out there and begin to overlay this is when I start to be able to see how these changes and the influences of the professional practice have occurred on the ground. So specifically in developing the Urban Tree Archive, I use the municipal tree inventory. So these really come out of asset management programs. They're meant to be asset management geospatial databases, and really going through and looking, they have a lot of information about where the tree is, what kind of property it's on, whether it's irrigated or not, what species it is, when it was planted, when it was last cared for, so much information. And they also, a regular standard measurement of trees is the diameter at breast height. So you have both a temporal marker and a size marker of that tree. And then I was able to find regional growth rates for common trees in the urban environment on the Front Range. And since the Front Range only gets about 13 inches of precipitation a year, things grow a lot slower, and there's a pretty select variety. But with these, I was able to use the ecological backcasting formula. So really what it is, it's very straightforward, really, this is an estimating the year of establishment. I'm really looking at when did this tree get planted? And this is not an exact date, but the benefit of this is that I can look at a very large region and with a few calculations, get a timeline of these trees over a long span of time. So using the mean annual growth rate, I can get the estimated year with the average growth rate. And the diameter breast height, I can get the estimated year of establishment. There's 19 trees. So this is a selection. This is not all the trees, but this is the 19 trees that there were growth rates available for. But what I did like about this list of tree species in terms of somebody who thinks about plants and what is being planted is that these are all really familiar trees. they're pretty common trees anywhere in the United States, but these growth rates here in Denver are going to be pretty specific, but also that there's a mix between deciduous and coniferous trees, so I can kind of begin to see sort of where different species went. I was curious in these ways. And interesting, I also love that there's some trees, like a Russian olive tree is one that was listed. That is, you know, a real management bane tree right now, but it was actively planted before the 1950s. So just being able to see this sort of mix of, and then crabapple right there. So we have like this really big mix of the different kinds of trees you'd see in an urban environment. And so breaking this down, I'll tell you a little bit more about the timeline breaking down. And this is the full picture. So I was able to see like how many trees are estimated from before World War I. So these are obviously, you can see some of these trees out there, the oldest trees, and so on. So breaking it down, I broke this down specifically because I was really interested in moments of expansion and urban growth in Denver and kind of looking at that together. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And obviously there's going to be just natural attrition in terms of tree death, right? You have much fewer in the earlier than you do later on. But really interesting to see sort of what is the most prevalent and the most abundant in each of those time periods. So I have a couple maps here to just show you a little bit of what I presented or what I kind of was able to combine, and then I'll go into a couple more details around Denver. So this map here overlays trees that were established between the two world wars, as well as racial covenants and racial demographics from the city in 1940. And you can really begin to see, one, just how green space expands, and that really does overlap a lot with racial covenants in this time period, which is not surprising. This is something that is very well documented and very well researched. But it was kind of interesting to see it kind of all playing out in time, right? It's not, we're looking back at this, it's like all of these things really did go in place at the same time. And one really interesting one here specifically is that this park here is Lakewood Gulch in Denver, and that from where it is predominantly white, it was turned into a park during this time. The topography, the landscape is exactly the same, running all the way here to the Platte River, but predominantly Chicano at that period of time, that was a dump. So just, it's really evident. Some of the things became very evident as you were looking at the parts that became parks and the parks that were left sort of in disrepair. And so one example. Here's another one where just being able to, same time period, but overlaying median property values from that time period and seeing that, wow, it's kind of amazing that the majority, so many of the trees we have surviving from this time period are in places that were the wealthier parts of the city. Again, not surprising by any means, but it's interesting to see that this is kind of who has taken on the planting and been able to keep these trees alive, had a really strong correlation at that point in time with property values. I have a cal showing, but I want to pause for a moment, see if there's any questions. I have one question for you, obviously. Yeah.
What is the total area of this project? Is it all of Denver County or is it a smaller area? Roughly how many?
All of Denver County. But you know, because it is over a period of time, Denver really expands, which I have a couple of maps. You'll see the change in the boundaries over time. And that was a little bit of, I went back and forth in terms of keeping the boundary to the current time period or matching the city boundaries over time. And I ended up matching the city boundaries over time because I was really looking a little bit in the governance standpoint. And so was interested in terms of urban planning and urban governance, where the city and county had power over the green spaces, and that was within the city boundaries. So it made the most sense for me to be keeping my scope within the city boundaries, but then watching as the city boundaries grew. In the 1960s, that became very contentious because of water in particular. So there were times where it kind of bled outside of the city, but it's mostly bound by the city. Yes. Yeah.
Did you notice any trends in terms of like what was planted in different like segregated neighborhoods? Like were there trends of particular species being planted in like the more not white neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods?
You ask great questions. Yes. We'll get to that. I have a little bit of that here, but yes, that's was sort of one of my interesting, questions just in how I look at the world is how does our cultural attachment to different kinds of species, how is that reflected in the vegetation of a city? Yeah. Any other questions? So I do have a question that, I think one, growth rates are only available for part of it, right? So this is not all the trees in the city. And two, this is not everything that was planted, right? This is everything that's survived. And so I am curious, this is something that I kind of wrestle with, which is why I have it as a question to the group, is survivorship sufficient for really looking at these historical moments, or is it really not enough? I don't know. I can't decide. So that's why I'm asking. No strong feelings. I will say that I asked this recently to some people who are more in the material studies world, and their response was, when you think about it as an archive, that's actually very appropriate because an archive is always selective. Like that's a good point, right? That if this is it has been selected. It's just not necessarily selected by a curator or selected by one person and selecting what they put in there, right? What it is sort of a collective selection over several decades. Okay, so why Denver? Well, one, because I was there, but two, I grew up in the high plains in Nebraska, and after living in the upper Midwest, was very excited to go back to the high plains. And got there and was a little disappointed in my landscape architecture forefathers who had planted like things that do not belong there. I was like, there's so many more interesting plants. Why do we have these things here? Is really what it came down to, is me looking around and saying, how did this happen? I'm very, very curious. Another reason is that Denver is a really great example in terms of urban planning history. So Denver was founded in 1858. That is about, just to give you an idea, about the same time that Central Park starts getting built 1861, 1865. So we have these East Coast cities that are starting to say, whoa, we did not plan for green space. We did not plan enough for this kind of density. We really have to figure out how to get this back into a city. And so from really anywhere further east, further west, cities, Omaha, Chicago, Kansas City, Twin Cities, Denver had the opportunity to say, how do we start from the get-go? And how do we start keeping our green space and planning around this green space? Because we realize the importance of it. We can take that lesson from these bigger cities. But Denver, as opposed to Kansas City or Omaha or Chicago, is on the high plains, and it only gets about 13 inches of precipitation a year, as opposed to those East Coast cities or even, east of the Mississippi that get anywhere from 30 to 45 inches of precipitation a year. So you're taking this sort of design standard from a very green place and placing it onto a very beige place, right? And so that's an interesting, what then that does is it becomes very obvious where water is, becomes very obvious where the design and the intervention has taken place. And
say that's a very optimistic view of the South Platte River, that It's usually just a mere trickle.
100%. So one of the things that you also see is that there was a lot of promotion of how Denver looked as an aspirational viewpoint. So Denver was the home to the Ute and Arapaho for centuries, really more of nomadic tribal indigenous tribes on the Front Range. And this was a common place to come at the confluence of the Cherry and the South Platte, because you did have some vegetation, choke cherries, cottonwoods. But the rest of the city, every tree that's there was planted or kind of came about after trees had been introduced. So just had a lot of robust information because it's kind of a younger city. There was a real promotion of it in being green. And it really has had a very robust design field for quite some time. It's a really interesting and vital city design. So there's two things that I just want to talk about a little bit today is sort of what can we learn from these, and sort of why do I think this longitudinal record is even helpful from an applied standpoint. And there's kind of two things that I'll say today is that one, I'm interested in what is the durability of our work that we do as planners and designers, and what makes it durable, what has a lasting impact. And then two, how do those species sort of line up with other sort of cultural ideologies that were happening at different times? So the first one, tree planting is everywhere. I'm sure all of you have been a part of or seen a tree planting initiative. And so this is sort of, as this is happening right now, it's talked about all the time, me wanting to say, well, what happens if we look back and understand a little bit more about what does make them successful, especially in a place where trees are not commonly available? I think it's a great place to learn from. So what it really came down to, and this was a nice surprise, that Denver hosted the first urban scale tree giveaway. Between 1905 and 1911, Mayor Spear, right there on your left, gave away about 110,000 saplings to the public. He was really within that early progressive era, early 1900s, saying, we need shade, we need tree-lined streets, we need the city to look like a city from the East Coast and attract people, but we also need it to be more pleasant because it's very intense. And how do we do that? And how do we do that quickly? And we need to plant a lot of trees quickly. So one, this is Spear Boulevard. For those of you that are familiar with Denver, this still looks quite a bit like Spear Boulevard. That curve and the trees, it's really that kind of legacy of the work that he did is evident everywhere, not just in name as Spear Boulevard, but in the work that he did across the city. So he every year, trees were given away. They very quickly outpaced the source that was available locally and had to start shipping them in on trains from the East Coast. And because they were after quick shade, they gave away red maple, silver maple, and American elm. So three very common quick growing species. And each year it kind of moved into certain different parts of the city. But it was celebrated both locally as well as nationally in the 1910s as a real holding up as an example of what can happen if you start to give away trees to the public. And so if I look back at that cohort and say, like, what was available, or what trees that were given, those species were given away, what's still there? What's interesting is there's about over 200 that are from this time period that were species that were given away or planted. So then overlaying that with parks and water infrastructure, you start to see where the ones that are surviving from this time period. It's not surprising that a lot of them are, one, in managed green spaces, places where they have been tended and stewarded for a long time, but also adjacent to major water sources. So that part of this longevity really is part of that like committed stewardship, right? And you can dig deeper down into that, not necessarily looking for causation in this case, but sort of long-term learning, what does make things happen in a place like this. I also think what's interesting in terms of species dispersion, you see a lot more of the elm down here and a lot more of the silver maple up in North Denver, which I'll mention really briefly later. But a couple of the things that really came out and looking closer at the archives about what did make this a successful campaign is that there was absolutely a shared interest in making this successful. For the first 3 years, trees had to be planted on the boulevard or the tree lawn or the terrace, whichever you want to say. And only once then, if there was a tree in front of your house on that public property, could you plant it on your own property. So there was a real investment that we're planting for the public good, right? There was also a significant amount of attention toward planting and watering. First couple of years, it was pretty rough. They had a high level of mortality in their trees, and they started to say, what makes it so these trees get established? And they started going out. The urban foresters would go visit people. They started doing a lot more about the literature and how to take care of these trees. They started investing in sprinkling trucks that would go and help water the trees. So they learned a little bit early on about what made it very successful. The other piece that was really interesting to me is that in terms of what we talk about oftentimes in the disparities in tree canopy is because, or in relationship to areas that were redlined. And what you can actually see in Denver is that this is pre-redlining. This is before redlining has even happened. This disparity in tree canopy is already being established. And so it's not just racial systemic biases later on. It's really very early on. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, just the process in getting a tree. Really, there were definitely barriers depending on whether or not you had to own your property, or you had to at least have a landlord that would allow you to plant a tree, because you had to have written approval. So you had to also be able to speak English and write English in order to get a tree. So there was already in the shape of that tree giveaway, some of those biases and those early disparities in tree canopy being laid. So then this is looking a little bit more at the entire temporal scale. So what if I look at all of it and start to say across the entire temporal scale, what do I start to see? What are the patterns that emerge? And again, back to that historical significant moments, as a city grows and a city extends itself and begins to change with the times, how is that evident in some of these tree patterns? So this is trees from each of those periods laid over with land use, land cover data. And what is interesting here, one, you see there's the city boundary growing from 1940 to 2000, where it has stayed the same. Airport is way off the side, that's not included, but the majority of trees that are surviving to today are on residential property or on the public right of way in front of a residential area. So again, that overall stewardship that occurs in order to keep trees alive in an area that does not necessarily have trees is spaces that you have tenants that can take care of them. But then also what I find very interesting is that it's the early places, it's very much a path dependency. You have a lot of trees going in the same places over and over and over again. So just the ability for, because there is the water, whatever it might be, the water infrastructure does exist to get them watered. But it's interesting, you have so many trees surviving in these areas and then planted in those same areas the next year, and then in those same areas the next decades. Also can see how many of the green spaces are just parks that are keeping these trees alive. And you can see a little bit also in terms of these lighter green dots. Those are places that at the time were read to be prairie or open land. So you can start to see how trees are sort of some of the first things that get put in as a city starts to move out further and further into the hinterlands. So I overlaid these things, sort of curious in that sort of expansion and sort of what was being expanded and what was being used in those different periods. And when looking at each of them, I noticed that there were only 5 trees that appeared. There were only 2 trees that appeared in the top 5 every year. Honey locust and silver maple. Until 1980. Honey locust stays, silver maple drops way down. So curious, like I knew about silver maple with spear, but why are there so many silver maple? Again, floodplain tree. Why is it here on the high plains? But then again, a whole bunch of them after World War II. So wanting to dig a little bit more into sort of the use of these trees and why these particular species. So when looking at those top 3 species and mapping them over the city, again, you could start to see how they're going in areas as the city moves outward. So there's certainly a relationship between new places being built and these really prominent species being used, a lot of abundance in those particular species as the city moves outward. And then if you look at the literature and see how these trees are talked about, you can see some evidence. In 1911, you hear from Mayor Spear that the maple was the most popular, especially on the North Side Station, because shade is not as prevalent over there. In 1945, we hear about how it's one of the most useful trees for its fast growth and clean appearance. And then in the 1960s, when this 63 is when this was printed, she says that the silver maple is nevertheless a very useful tree, although not one of the most superior. We're getting some pushback in some places, but this town has largely been due to an adaptable species like this, the role it has played. So after this prominence, after so long, what really happened? Why does it die off? Well, I had some ideas, was kind of curious that I knew water becomes, especially in the 1960s, starts to become a much bigger topic sort of across the city, but not so much with the plant communities, which was interesting. But by the 1980s, it gets labeled a high water needs plant. And any extension services bulletin, any nursery catalog, you now see silver maple and high water. That floodplain label is now actually part of its when you are out on the market purchasing. And then in 2016, it was actually a planting moratorium, and it can no longer be planted in the city of Denver. So this real steep decline, which I think especially interesting in terms that right now water is always a concern, but shade is also a big concern in terms of evening out that urban climate and urban heat part of the canopy disparity. There's still the need for quick shade. So what other species can be brought in that might be able to serve that really quick shade, but not have quite the water consumption? Is there one? Not quite sure. Very similar thing happened to the honey locusts. But the honey locusts had a different sort of, they were always advertised as very drought tolerant. And I don't think I have so much one of the maps that I have here, but in that, especially that interwar period when there were so many honey locusts, there was not very much conversation in the city of Denver about the overall Dust Bowl happening and the major droughts happening outside the city in the late 20s and early 30s. But in terms of the trees that are most prevalent, it is one of those trees that is the most drought tolerant. So interesting way to kind of look and see that maybe it wasn't top of mind, but it certainly maybe impacted the ability for certain trees to survive, which is maybe why there are more of the honey locusts available, but also probably about what was on the market and what you could get. There were the trees that were very drought tolerant. Honey locust also is an interesting tree because in the 1960s, it started to become very popular in modernist designs. So you had a lot of urban renewal projects. You'll have honey locusts associated with them because the sort of the interesting bark, their branching pattern, their bright yellow leaves that all drop at the same time creates a very dramatic visual experience. And that was really popular within modernist designers. So this is a drawing from Jane Silverstein Reese. It's the first landscape architect, a female landscape architect in Denver. And she's actually talking an interest. I like this little passage because she's pushing back. DURA is Denver Urban Renewal Authority. And they have said that in the urban renewal area downtown, they only want ash trees. And she pushes back and says, I disagree. I would like to have honey locust, please. Because I am especially worried about a borer for the that's happening with the ash trees. Not the same emerald ash borer now, but there are concerns about it being susceptible. But the replacement is the honey locust. So an interesting note as to sort of who was making these decisions and sort of where the decisions about species were coming from, that you had things like Urban Renewal Authority saying we want it to look a certain way. So we want ash trees, and her kind of pushing back with this very popular tree at the time. And if you actually look at the city of Denver right now, from what has been planted, what was very common for the last 40 years is ash trees, which now that emerald ash borer is in Denver is especially precarious. But the bright yellow is honey locust. And what I love about this right here is that you can see a majority of the urban renewal that happened right in downtown is where you see those honey locusts still present. And yet honey locust is now on the no plant list and a moratorium as well because of its overpopularity and overuse, and some concerns about its insect susceptibility. So kind of a similar conversation about sort of overplanting of one species. But again, back to that, it's a very drought tolerant species. What's another very drought tolerant species? And I think now there's a lot more conversation about sort of the origination of plants, where they're coming from, what is an appropriate plant to plant in certain regions. And this is a place that didn't have any trees other than cottonwoods to begin with. So what are the trees to plant in this area? So a couple more questions for you, but I'm more interested in questions you may have. Or I can go back. Yeah, go ahead.
I was curious why there's an absence of aspen trees. I would think they might have an advantage in that they're relatively local and wouldn't have to be brought in from the East Coast.
Well, aspen trees are actually not necessarily found in Denver. They're found up at a higher elevation in the foothills beginning. But they are part of the populus family, which is the same as cottonwoods. And cottonwoods are not allowed to be planted in the city of Denver or the city of Madison. It's a commonly no plant species. But the reason, so you can't plant aspen in the city of Madison on the boulevard, nor can you plant cottonwoods, but it is because it's not really, they tend to break in the urban environment. But that wasn't necessarily, for a long time, that was one of the common trees you saw. They're just not very long lived either, just another reason they're not on this list. But there is an interesting sort of movement of the mountain plants into the city, especially in the early 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. And then afterwards, they kind of realized like these are two different locations. But there was an attempt to sort of make your house in Denver feel like it was in the mountains, which I think is one of the reasons that you have these weird plants, because you're not in the mountains at all. But people like to think that they are. Good question. Other questions? Yes, please. I did. So there's a couple, the archive of, so McClure, Elsie McClure documented the early city of Denver from about 1905 to 1918. He took pictures all over the city. And his archive is available at Denver Public Libraries. That was an excellent one. I used aerial imagery. There's and could get most of what I wanted. In terms, I have one portion of this where I look specifically at different parks. But the land use land cover map that did use aerial photography and then that was transferred into GIS data was more of what I used in terms of the analysis at this standpoint. But especially when I was looking at different species, one of the reasons this is here actually is there are 2 different species planted here. And one of the things that they did in early Denver was to use nurse trees, where they planted a fast-growing species and a slower-growing species next to one another. And that recently came up in terms of their current urban forestry plan, if that would be a good idea to do again. And I purposely went back and looked for a couple of trees or pictures from that. So Denver Public Library has a pretty great collection. And the aerial imagery, kind of depending on where I was looking at.
How early is the aerial?
I mean, I think the first one is the late 30s, that you have expansive aerial imagery. The 1937 land cover is partially because of that. Yeah. It was an interesting part of, there's another, Mac McBurney took a lot of pictures of the Five Points neighborhood in Denver in the 1940s to the 1980s. And a lot of those images, it was really nice to be able to look back at, if I was looking at a certain particular species in a certain area, and then go back and look at his photos and be able to find images of trees in those areas. So in that way. Other questions? Please.
Similar to this type of tree planting effort in cities in the high plains or the intermountain region.
Yes. So actually, so the first book, like Trees of Denver, there's from the Extension Services, which at the time was Colorado Agricultural College, now Colorado State University. They published in 1905 a book about, or a booklet about what trees could be grown in Denver. Really in working to say, look what can be grown here. It doesn't have, you can turn the plains into a forest, essentially. Interestingly enough, they really said, do not plant the silver elm, which I think, or silver maple, which I think is interesting that was completely ignored. But the Extension Services played a really big role. They were founded in 1914, but the High Plains Research Station, there's one in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then at Colorado State University, there's a pretty big perennial garden research station that occurs. But most of the tree research was happening up in Cheyenne, and continues to this point. But there was a pretty big coordination. So, prior to the Extension Services starting in 1914, in the late 1880s, you start to see conversations between railroad companies experimenting with trees growing along the railroads, what can get planted, and different high stations, U.S. Forest Service, the Halsey Nursery in central Nebraska, talking about what can be grown in more arid environments. And that kind of, continued. But there was one man who really pushed it in the 60s and 70s, saying we need more specifically about trees in urban environments and dry areas, but still very active portion of research. So as my question for you, given that you are geospatial people here, what other urban data sets? I'm curious if there's other data sets that you know of or have used, that either could be used as archives or in conjunction with an archive like this. And then thoughts about doing this in a place like Madison, where it's not as evident that watered, not watered is not as evident here in a place like Madison. So I'm curious about how to adjust something like this for a space where the design hand is not so clear. So data sets, any thoughts? Data sets that you've used? Yeah.
It's based and more people based.
Mhm.
We use a lot of census data, whether that's in, or, yeah, race.
Yeah, the one of the things that I've found very interesting in working with census data, historic census data, is especially when you're looking at race, is that it's not consistent in how race is categorized or considered. And so it takes some research of other sources to verify what really actually, so in terms of the 1940, this, when you look at what is available for the census, there is just this small portion of non-white in Denver, but the purple, the larger purple, is actually was I found from other sources. There was a dissertation written in the 70s that was very specific about the different minority populations in early Denver, he had really great maps. And there's a lot of documentation of the Mexican American population that lived in Auraria that was part of the urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s. They lost, but that doesn't show up in the census because of how race is classified over different time periods. So that took a little bit of extra digging, depending on what era. It wasn't until the 1960s that it was more standardized.
Like your photos, you can use to like look at income, like,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Another, early on when I was looking at this is that one of early records of property that talk about things like plumbing, indoor plumbing, where indoor plumbing existed, where it didn't exist, where water taps were being, so in the engineer reports or housing stock reports were also very helpful in kind of getting an understanding of what the city felt like and the lived experience was like prior to the 1950s. That was a fun one. Yeah.
like a material archive could be like the history of the waterways in the area and how they have been altered or not, but most likely altered by people, especially in the last 150 years. And I feel like there's a number of different ways in which that information can be accessed, whether through historical maps, aerial photos, over time, things like that. But I think that is maybe a little like slipperier with our kind of just by the nature of water, but could be a complementary piece to the nature.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the water development is a really important, especially the story, right? But I think in general, especially because I think it's not as evident here, but it's actually very much, right? It's a very engineered hydrology that we live in here in Madison. And so, how to be able to map, especially in terms of, there is a map of early springs in Denver. Before 1900 and before Denver water existed, that was actually all spring-fed drinking water in downtown Denver. So it's pretty well documented in many areas, but it's not consistent and through different time periods. And that's actually another one where the photos became very helpful because you would kind of read a little bit in an engineering report, but then you'd see more evidence of what was happening along the Platte River in photo documentation. So yeah, I think water is a very interesting one for me in terms of water and vegetation are always related. And it's trickier because there's both the natural existing hydrology, the manipulated hydrology, the surface hydrology, right, like the engineered, there's a lot more to wrangle, but I agree, very interesting. Well, we're at time, but I don't want to, if anybody has any more questions. Yeah.
Just had a question in the field, a little bit. I was wondering, do you have any comparative data for Commerce City, Colorado? That would be the place I think was heavily Hispanic.
Yeah.
And also heavily has heavy industry. It was just sort of the general butt of jokes.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so for those of you that are familiar with Denver or not familiar with Denver, Commerce City sits right up here north of the city of and county of Denver, has part of the Platte River that runs through it, but it is most definitely still very industrial, heavy industrial. Right. Whereas a lot of the northern portion of Denver's industrial has really gone away. And there's actually been a really big work in the urban hydrology of that area of northern Denver. But Commerce City is still, I think, for the majority, still very industrial. There are certainly parts of it that I think they have worked very hard to kind of invest in the green infrastructure of it. But yeah, right along the northern border, this is a very contentious and contested part of the city, most definitely.
I was just gonna ask, because I'm sure you looked at Sanborn maps, if there was any information you were able to glean from those maps and this study, even though I was looking at obviously the type. And I'm just thinking back to, I don't know, some of you may have gone to Jack Schwab's talk on Sanborn maps a few months ago that was talking about some things that he was able to figure out based on looking at a bunch of different maps that were not immediately there on the surface.
I didn't look at any Sanborn maps for this research, but I did for earlier work in Denver. I was curious about, there's a little area of Denver that's Japantown, that was a little Japantown in the early 1900s and then really grew after World War II. And it's now like, it resisted the urban renewal that happened in the 60s. And I was very curious about how that happened. And one of the things that I was able to see in Sanborn maps is that the Buddhist temple was there. And that really became an anchor for that community to rally around and say this Buddhist temple needs to be able to stay. And so to be able to look at the Sanborn maps and see that it existed for a very long time. And that was, they also had a Japanese American who was working in the planning department and really kind of understood the ways to talk about their built environment in a way that it was deserving of protection at the time. So I've used it in other parts of my work, but I haven't so much. I think if I was looking, especially in some of the like oldest trees and wanting to understand them more, that's where I would start to look at Sanborn maps and see if they were still existing then. Yeah.
We're a little past time, so I think, you know, if you have any more questions, yeah, I'm gonna volunteer you to stick around for a few minutes.
Absolutely.
To answer questions. But let's thank Anna for her talk.
And please reach out. I'm not teaching this semester, so I'm not on campus very much, but I'm always happy to talk about projects or work or